if you're sitting there right now debating on putting an offer on a house, you've maybe made a couple of offers, your offers haven't gotten rejected because you're getting beaten up by these other offers. Is it time to capitulate and wait for a better moment, or do you just keep pushing?
Well, I think everybody's in the same situation. So, and with rents going up too, it's really hard for some people to see what a mortgage payment is going to be on a certain price point of house, and then see what their rent is going to continue to, and it's continuing to rise. I mean, my son has been in a rental for 3 years now, and every time he renews, it goes up and up and up. But he's not in a situation to buy right now. But even if if a buyer is considering the two, I still think it's better to buy now, because there's always that possibility interest rates go down and you have the ability to renegotiate that based on a refinance. So you go in a refinance, you're going to still pay closing costs and things that were refinanced. But if I see 8% in October when they hit, we had buyers dropping completely out of the market because they couldn't see. They all they saw it as a temporary increase. They did not realize this was going to continue.
Welcome, Todd. We are excited to have you on this special guest episode. There have been some recent, I'll say that as an advisor, everybody that we work with when it comes to selling a house has an opinion on real estate commissions. Some people have favorable opinions, some people not so much. And it seems like real estate commissions have come under fire in recent years. And I think most of the listeners have probably seen this headline recently. So can you tell us a little bit? Well, I guess backing up a second, tell us a little bit about what it is that you do, your relation to the real estate world, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about this case.
Sure. Well, I got into real estate in 2004. I was still teaching school at the time, and I'm a retired school teacher of 30 years. And I've been here in Cincinnati for 12 years now. Used to be a trainer and a coach for new agents when they came into our office at Comey and Shepherd and in Montgomery. And then recently I gave that up in 2021 and just focused entirely on being a selling and a buying agent. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's in 2021. What a time to make that choice.
It was actually a good choice because I got extremely busy in 2020, and that's what led me to kind of give up the training portion and just focus entirely on selling and buying and helping them out.
Yeah, so it made some economic sense.
It did, yeah, and time sense as well, because I couldn't have kept doing both training and this market starting in 2020 and how extremely busy I've been.
Yeah. And talk to I'm sure all the listeners were alive through this period of time. No, it's not news to anybody that interest rates have shifted a lot since that. I mean, how has the real estate market changed from an agent's perspective over the last couple of years?
Oh, boy. Well, yeah, we've seen quite a number of changes since COVID. It's kind of everybody puts that as a baseline, and things have really changed a lot since then. But yeah, interest rates fluctuate. Interest rates have gone extremely low back in the 2019, 2020. People were getting 3.5% interest rates. And then in October this past year, they jumped up to 7 and 8%. And now they seem to be leveled off around the 7 and 8 right now. So we've seen the interest rate changes. And, over the years, I've seen a lot of changes. So I think the agents that have been around a while, one broker in our company calls it shift happens in real estate. So you got to roll with the punches, and I think you got to be up on the news as well, just for our purposes educationally. So, yeah.
Well, and that's a really good pivot comment, maybe a good segue to one of the things that goes through my head, which I'll just talk about the advisory business for a second. As financial advisors, when I was a kid, a financial advisor really was a salesperson. They were basically somebody that connected you to the ability to invest, and they got paid to essentially help you make investments. Over the last few decades, for a number of reasons, Vanguard and Fidelity and Charles Schwab have kind of created this more access to investing and cheaper commissions. And what it's done is it's put a lot of pressure on advisors to rethink how they deliver value to the clients that they serve. And it's really put an emphasis on consultation. So cynically, as an advisor, I kind of look at the real estate the real estate side, and I say, okay, when is that coming? And that's a little bit of what we're here to talk about today. So I'm interested in your perspective before we get there as a trainer. When you were training real estate agents a handful of years ago, what were you like? How were you coaching themselves to differentiate themselves?
Well, value added is a huge thing back then, and now it's even more of an emphasis. But to a new agent starting out, the coaching process was about relationships and relational selling. Not the word sales always gets a negative in people's minds. They think sales, they think negative things. We're a pushy, car salesman type thing. But we Comey and Shepard has really grasped a program called Ninja Selling, and it's all about relationship, building a relationship first with your clients and getting to know them on a deeper level with questions behind the questions, that kind of thing. I don't know if you ever read the book QBQ, but that was a good book to really dig deep into. So you take a question from a buyer or a seller, and then you just ask a deeper question, and you get to know them as a valued client too. Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, the ability to sell well is not to shove something down somebody's throat, but rather the ability to understand better what somebody's really looking for, so that you can make sure that you put the right thing in front of them, basically.
And essentially, like you guys are trusted advisors, and that's what we want to become to our clients, are trusted advisors.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So tell us a little bit about the recent court case, and I guess for the listener, just introduce what's really changed recently in real estate.
Well, back in the fall, and I don't know the exact targeted date when this first happened, but there was a lawsuit that some sellers had brought in Missouri against a couple of very big brokerages. And essentially, they were saying that, in a way, they were saying that they were not advised properly on how to handle buyer brokerage commissions. So I don't know exactly what these brokerages said, but there was a lawsuit because of this, not being transparent with the commission that the seller was paying the brokerage. And we've been preparing for this at Comey and Shepard ever since then, because we knew that we were headed in this direction because of this lawsuit. But it's never been, and the NAR, National Association of Realtors, were also sued, but the NAR has never set commissions and never will set commissions. And that's basically what this was saying. So to boil right down to it, there is no typical commission rate. We typically, you do have a seller commission that the listing brokerage charges, but the buyer brokerage was what came into question. So the transparency there, where that's always been negotiable, but these brokerages were, I guess, not being transparent with that. And it seemed to sellers like we were kind of telling them that this is a set commission. But in essence, it should always be negotiable, and always has been negotiable.
So I've been through real estate transactions in my life, and when I've seen a 6% transaction, that wasn't necessarily a requirement to pay a 6% transaction.
No, never has been. No.
Okay. So when, I would think that comes to a surprise to some people listening to this, because when you ask your real estate agent, how much do I pay you and is there wiggle room? I don't know if those answers are typically, yeah, we can negotiate it. What were those conversations like as a trainer? I'm sure that was something that you had to coach these realtors on how to handle.
Right. Well, and new agents too, they were coming in with the assumption that the listing brokerage and the seller was paying all the commission to the listing brokerage and to the buyer brokerage, where that assumption shouldn't have happened because well, and to be honest with you, in the MLS, the buyer's brokerage commission was always listed on the MLS. And then part of this settlement is going to change that. So when I look up a house and send it to a buyer of mine, I'm going to be able to tell them right away that the seller is offering to pay the buyer brokerage this percentage. Therefore, they would not necessarily have to bring anything to me, to the brokerage, not to me. I shouldn't say me, but to our brokerage as money. Yeah.
And so how is this, like, if I'm going to buy a house now and say I've hired a realtor and I ask them, hey, how do your fees play into the price that we're going to sell the house for? And is there any wiggle room on what we pay and how we pay it? I know in the past, kind of to your point, what I hear is like seller concessions.
Yes.
Right. So as this, if somebody's trying to buy my house from me and we get to the due diligence period and let's say they find something they don't like or what have you, they might try to beat me up and essentially incentivize me to maybe pay a part of their commission or buy their interest rate down or fix something. Right. Is that what we're kind of talking about when we talk seller concessions?
In seller concessions, yes. And most of the time, the listing brokerage does have a recommended fee that for them as a list. So at Comey Shepherd, we I guess strive to get 3% because that's what we're on the
which
listing
is half of
side.
6.
Yes, which is half of 6. So it's not on top of the 6.
Right.
That's what basically Comey is charging to market the house.
Yep.
And all to. And then, but it's the buyer's brokerage commission where when you say 6%, usually it's 3 to listing and 3 to the buyer's brokerage. I mean, when I first came into Cincinnati, I was looking at 7%. There was a lot of companies that were doing, and a lot of agents and brokerage that were doing 7% commission, 4% to the listing brokerage and 3% to the buyer brokerage. But in all transparency, that's where this lawsuit came in, is because the sellers didn't feel like there was any wiggle room in paying that buyer broker.
Sure. And I would imagine the industry has probably always had a little bit of frustration when it comes to the listing agent feels like they do a lot of work to list the house. And then, they're the selling side of the equation is taking an equivalent fee. I can't imagine that rubs everybody the right way all the time. Right. So is this seen as a good thing how does the real estate world looking at the impact of this?
Well, at Comey, we've always, when I trained agents, I always tried to get them to really work on a buyer consultation. You always have a listing consultation, and there's always a listing contract that is signed by the sellers. But some agents have done the buyer brokerage agreement as well. But now we're getting pushed into that. So I shouldn't say pushed. So in all transparency, this settlement that is out there right now has not been signed by the judge yet. Signed by the court. It's
a headline.
Yes, it's a headline, and it will probably soon be decided, but nothing is in writing and signed yet. So that's a misconception. A lot of people that I've talked to think this is already a done deal, and it's not. It hasn't been signed yet. But to go back to the buyer brokerage consultant, I try to get all my agents to sit down and do a value-added approach to the buyers, like spell out exactly what they're going to do in the whole process to help the buyers out. We do that with the listing side. There's always have done that with the listing side. But especially in these last few years, especially buyers that get leads, like Realtor.com, Zillow leads, a lot of agents will just meet them at the house, show them the house, write up a contract, and it's nothing discussed about what they're doing. This lawsuit, if it gets signed, is going to force what's called a buyer agent or a buyer brokerage agreement to be signed by every buyer. So if this is signed into law, that is what will happen. So as buyer's agents, we're going to have to show them what our value is at, because they might have to pay this commission. So we'll talk about that later, probably.
Right. So back to transparency, it's not that they didn't know that they were paying it before. I mean, in essence, they were paying it before, because the 6%, even though it was, quote, paid by the seller, economics dictate that it should price itself into the transaction as a whole.
Correct.
But what you're pointing out is that they're going to have a sit down conversation about the fact that they're paying this, and it's going to put further pressure on, I'll say that the selling side has always been the more coveted position for realtors, correct? Like I think in the real estate agent space, you really want to get listings as opposed to buyers, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And that's just because it's much easier to list one house and sell one house than to show 10 and potentially sell one. I mean, it seems, and especially in today's world, I mean, gosh, I imagine the world of a buyer's agent has been just ripped upside down.
Oh.
I don't know where to start, whether it be the lower volumes. I mean, I don't think anybody looking down at their 2 and 3% mortgage wants out, or you look at, the cash deals that are in the space. I mean, I can't tell you how often I'm on some social media, scrolling through Facebook, and I see some, person in the community complaining about how they're getting outbid on offers and they're struggling to be able to make a competitive bid. So, I guess you said the shift happened. So that's the quote from you. Do you think that this world we live in, where it's really hard, like it is a seller's world, like, do you see any end to that?
Well, to qualify you, that's not my quote.
Sure.
So it's a broker from Comey and Shepard named as Karen Schlosser, who she came up with that quote.
Thanks, Karen.
So my mind was on that. I'm sorry. So go back to your question then again.
The world today seems so skewed to the seller, in the sense that if you're not coming up with either a cash offer or no contingencies, I mean, the juice that you have to add on an offer to make yourself attractive as a buyer right now, I would assume is a lot, right?
Correct.
For the listeners that are hoping to buy a house, so is there any hope for that?
Well, I mean, that's where a buyer's agent's value added is going to really come into play. It's going to be experience on the buyer's agent side to help the buyer out. Because, well, I'll give you a quick example I just recently had, and it's not just in the lower end. A lot of people think that it's this $300,000 to $400,000 price point is what everybody's going after, but I recently had a buyer that put in an offer on a $847,000 house, and we were in multiple offers, and we went way above list price with all kinds of contingencies waived in the inspections and things like that. And we got outbid by a cash offer for $930,000. So that's the kind of world buyer's agents are working in right now too. It's not just show one house, put an offer in at list price and you get it, because they've got to know the strategies behind getting an accepted offer. And that's one of the biggest value added parts of this that a buyer's agent is going to bring, is because they've been experienced in this multiple offer world in the last 3 to 4 years, and they know what it's going to take to get an offer. But then there's always cash, and that's the difficult thing to overcome.
So, yeah, so that was going to be my next question, is like, what's the hierarchy in terms of juicy things that you can add to your offer as a buyer? It sounds like cash sounds like the ultimate, maybe ultimate trump card, so to speak. Is it fair to say that making a cash offer generally outbids anybody else that's waived every other contingency, or what are some of the other levers that you can pull?
Well, the biggest thing with a cash offer is you don't have to worry about an appraisal. So you don't have to worry about a lender being involved with this. And then you come up with an appraisal and it's way low. And then there's some negotiation in there too. So with cash, that's I mean, a cash offer they can still have the right to an appraisal if they want it, but they're paying for it. But you just don't see that. That's kind of a contingency that gets waived automatically with a cash offer. So that's number one, but there are ways you can compete. For example, you can waive inspections. That's one thing a lot of people do. I never recommend it. I can't recommend it because there are so many hidden things, even in brand new construction, that can come up. So, but that is a strategy. Waiving inspections is one. Waiving an appraisal altogether. If someone has enough cash, they're putting 20 to 30% down, they have cash in reserve that they can use to come up with any appraisal gap. That's a big thing too. That's probably one of the second most important thing, even outside of an inspection waiver, is because if you can give an unlimited appraisal gap, that means your buyer is willing to come up with any gap in cash in addition to their down payment.
So basically, if you buy the house for, I'll just use easy numbers. You say, hey, I'm going to buy the house for $1 million. The bank is willing to lend you 80% of that million. So they'll lend you 800,000. And let's say the appraisal comes back at 900,000 or 800,000. And now the bank is only willing to lend 80% on that new lower value. You're still on the hook for the whole $1 million. The difference is now your down payment just got bigger.
Correct.
Right?
Yes,
okay.
Correct. But then some people put in limits on that gap appraisal. So you put an appraisal gap in that they'll cover an amount up to $30,000. And then hoping that they might be able to negotiate with that seller for any other gap that might come in there, but chances are not. So, yeah.
Okay. So cash offers, I'll call those simulated cash offers where you're willing to close appraisal gaps, because it seems like it's maybe an answer where you're like, hey, I don't have all of the money on hand, but I have a good enough chunk of money on hand to make sure we can get this financing. That's when you pull that lever from the way that I hear it. Yeah. And then waiving inspections just sounds like a horrible idea, because there's really no upside that's worth the downside of a shoddy house that could have got missed in an inspection. I think there's probably a whole discussion we could have around how to select the right inspector, probably to go along with that. But what about like things that I've also heard about in the past, like earnest money? I actually had a story. I've had two stories here, and I've always been curious about this. I had one person that they had agreed to sell their house. They had gotten a big earnest money check, and then the buyer, who had been a cash buyer, backed out, and they weren't able to keep their earnest money. I had a very similar situation where big earnest money check buyer backed out. Well, that person kept the earnest money. So like, I guess one of the things that I've always thought about is like, well, you didn't mention earnest money in your list. Like, where does earnest money fit into this whole thing?
That's tricky, because a lot of people, this is one thing that a buyer's agent should never tell a buyer is, if this doesn't go through, or if these contingencies are not met in this contract, for example, the loan, they can't get the loan, or the inspections come back, or there's three main contingencies in a contract. That's the loan itself, inspections, and appraisal. So a mistake that a lot of buyer's agents will say is that if these three aren't met, you'll get your earnest money back. But that's not the case, because if the seller disputes that, this could go on for 2 or more years, that earnest money
becomes
held.
A game of chicken, basically.
It's really held in the brokerage's account right now, non-interest bearing account, till it's settled. And then after 2 years, if it doesn't get, I'm not going to go into attorney because I'm not an attorney, but then typically that person will get the earnest money back unless the seller or whoever keeps disputing that earnest money. So it could be 2 years, it could be 10 years.
And this isn't like fun for either party. Like let's acknowledge, when I've seen this in real life, the seller wants out of their house. So you have to now, for this earnest money check, decide, do I want to potentially live here for another 2 years as I dispute this? Yeah, which is, I mean, not fun. And then as the buyer, you have to then, I mean, presumably you want to buy a house. Maybe you have the money just to tie this thing up for 2 years and potentially lose it. So maybe you can go do something else and not have to care, but maybe not. I mean, I guess what I'm getting to is, it seems like the person in the position with leverage at that point is probably the buyer, because the seller really wants out of their house and is sitting on a house that they don't want to be in at that point, right?
Well, they can still get, like the buyer would, typically in this situation, we get a termination of contract agreement signed, but with earnest money to be given back to them. That's what should be requested. And depending on the situation, that house could actually, if the termination of contract is signed, then it can go back on the market. And that earnest money is still trapped because the seller may not sign off on the earnest money to be released back to the buyer. But they can still get their house back on the market because the contract has been terminated.
Okay, so it doesn't necessarily hold you up.
No.
Okay.
No.
So really, how often do these things end up being problematic? Very rarely.
Rarely.
Interesting.
Rarely,
okay.
Yeah.
But it's not, I mean, I guess back to the original question, it doesn't sound like that's one of the big influencers on whether or not you're going to get a deal in the current real estate market.
No, but it can be. I mean, my buyer recently just, we won a contract because we had the unlimited appraisal gap, waived inspections. Unfortunately, I don't like doing that, but they waived inspections. And then he had a very large earnest money deposit they were willing to put down. I have seen, I've never done this, I've never had a buyer do it, but they actually will relinquish their right to get that earnest money back if the deal doesn't close. So they're essentially saying they're giving that money to the seller if they don't get to the closing table. And
it's just basically further support in the legal system to make sure that the buyer has the seller has protection that they're going to keep that money and not get tied up in the same process we just talked about.
Correct.
So basically, when something gets a little screwy, the right answer is to add a clause that just says, "No, I really promise."
And there's people that will put that in. That like, for an example, in the contingency paragraph, we have a blank paragraph in the contract. You could put in buyer waives inspections for their own knowledge, or they'll have
an inspection but only for so that they know.
Yeah, but I always add, and within the inspection period, buyer has the right to terminate the contract and get their entire earnest money back within a certain number of days.
Okay. So just like, and I think this is applicable, by the way, for a lot of contract. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I know you're not a lawyer, but in practice, when I've seen people draw up contracts or get contracts, they kind of assume that they just have to accept what's on the contract. And they forget that you can a lot of times write things in.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes that's really important, is to realize, like any contract, until you've agreed, it's a negotiation. And, the negotiation we're talking about is fairly in favor of the seller. So I don't know how much leverage the buyer has. It may be a game of just trying to think about how sweet does this deal need to go so I can cross my fingers and hope that we're going to get this one. Right. Mm-hmm. And maybe is that just a guessing game, or do you as the agent, like how do you as an agent maybe give them direction on like how much of that to do and what other offers might be out there?
And that's the thing that they will never know unless the seller gives the listing agent permission to share what the other offers are. And so you're basically putting in a sealed bid type. And that's what a lot of this is going to, is like all offers will be open till this time and the seller will make a decision by this time. We're seeing a lot more of that.
And I think if I understand it right, I think there's also what escalation. When I was looking at houses a couple of years ago, I know one of the things that we talked about doing was, you make an offer for this price, you say, but we'll beat any other offer better by such and such amount up to some upper limit, to kind of play this game of hopefully I'm not because nobody wants to offer a ton of money and then unbeknownst to them, they were $50,000 too high or something ridiculous, right?
Well, an escalation clause is definitely one that the only problem with the escalation clause, well, first of all, you got to put a cap on that escalation because you don't want to leave it unlimited.
Sure.
So you can put a cap on the escalation. The problem with an escalation clause is that you better have an appraisal gap to go with it, because if your escalation is going up $50,000 over list price, then there's the possibility that there's going to be a gap in that appraisal.
Right.
And so along with that, you better have an appraisal gap in there. unlimited or a dollar amount.
Have you seen deals that get right up to closing and fall through because of bad terms? I mean,
luckily I have not, but I've had it happen before. Yes.
What does that actually look like? I mean, in practicality, what happens? I mean,
most of the time it's a problem with the buyer getting the loan finalized. Years ago when I was first starting, I came to the closing table and we were at the closing. That's the only one I've had a situation like that happen. Came to the closing table, husband and wife. I was representing the buyers. We got there. The lender was there. The title officer that was closing the deal asked, "Have you taken on any debt recently?" And the husband said, "Yeah, I bought a motorcycle." And so, "Did you finance that motorcycle?" He goes, "Yes." And the title closing officer said, "Okay, we are stopping this right now. We need to talk to the lender." And they lost the deal because it changed their loan to value. It changed so many things about their credit that they could not qualify for the loan anymore. So loans are probably the biggest reason why things fall apart. Job loss is another one. I didn't have anybody, but a fellow agent in my office had one fall about 2 days before closing because they lost their job. And that was a term for the loan too. You have to be
you have to be employed.
Yeah. And they always call. A good lender will call 24 hours probably before closing to verify employment. So, yeah.
Wow. And is that good for anybody in the situation if something like that? I mean, it's bad for the seller. Correct. It's bad for the buyer. I mean, and it really speaks to back to the whole purpose of part of why we're talking here is that the real estate world is changing. It's putting more, I would argue, power in the pocket of the consumer to make choices on who's going to help them and what the value is for helping them. And I think it puts more ownership on the realtor or the agent to, as we've been discussing, really define like, what is it that I do that adds value and why do you pay for me? And by the way, again, this is similar to what's happened in the advisory world. The goal, the best advisors out there aren't necessarily trying to compete by making their price cheaper and cheaper than the other advisor. What they're really trying to do is make sure they deliver, quality advice for the fee that they're charging. And it's not about not getting paid, but it's about making sure that you are delivering the value. Right. Exactly. And so I don't think there's any layperson in the world, non-real, that wouldn't be excited at the ability to have more help from their realtor, more transparency. I mean, it seems like a good thing for the average person.
Well, and a lot of most listing agents, unless it's direct referral, they're basically competing for that listing against possibly other agents. And so I think we may see a little bit of a shift where there's going to be wise consumers out there that are going to interview buyer's agents. If they're going to be paying them anyway, why not get the best out there that's going to do the best for you? More experience. I think that's why consultation is going to be so important up front. You're going to have to basically have your resume, have all these things that you're going to do for that buyer in the whole process. Again, we keep going back to that term value added, but that's what this is going to come down to.
Yeah. Well, I like you mentioned it before, if you have an escalation clause, you better have the appraisal gap coverage. Correct. Because if you, I mean, it sounds like those two things together could easily lose you a deal. Yeah. And make something fall apart. So I think the art of having a good realtor is not only do they understand the area you're trying to buy a house in, what to be considerate of in a good versus bad house in that area, but then they've got to be able to, even though they're not a lawyer, walk you through this contract, provide thoughtful guidance on how to construct an attractive offer in a world where it's a very competitive situation. Going back to the point I was making earlier, which is, do you see this changing? From the advisory side, I mean, what the data suggests on our side is that for the last 15 years, housing has been underbuilt in the US. And so when you add up the fact that we've got household formation amongst millennials on top of low. I mean, is this just the world that we're in for the foreseeable future? Or, how might this shift as rates drop? I mean, what's the talk in between realtors?
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question directly with my answer, but I think what it's going to do for us as realtors is be better prepared, overall, be better prepared to advise buyers in the best possible way. Because I think we're going to get buyers come back on us saying, what are we paying you to do if you can't help us the way to get us a house? I don't know if that answers your question at all, but it's more.
Well, is there any hope that as interest rates go down, which hopefully, I guess the Fed's talking about lowering rates. Fed controls the short-term interest rates, but not the long-term, and mortgages price off of the longer-term interest rates. So we will have to see what the net effect of interest rates dropping is for mortgages. But like, if you're sitting there right now debating on putting an offer on a house, you've maybe made a couple of offers, your offers haven't gotten rejected because you're getting beaten up by these other offers. Is it time to capitulate and wait for a better moment, or do you just keep pushing?
Well, I think everybody's in the same situation. So, and with rents going up too, it's really hard for some people to see what a mortgage payment is going to be on a certain price point of house, and then see what their rent is going to continue to, and it's continuing to rise. I mean, my son has been in a rental for 3 years now, and every time he renews, it goes up and up and up. But he's not in a situation to buy right now. But even if if a buyer is considering the two, I still think it's better to buy now, because there's always that possibility interest rates go down and your lender you have the ability to renegotiate that based on a refinance. So you go in a refinance, you're going to still pay closing costs and things that were refinanced. But if I see 8% in October when they hit, we had buyers dropping completely out of the market because they couldn't see. They all they saw it as a temporary increase. They did not realize this was going to continue.
Right.
And now buyers are saying, well, this is not changing. So do we want to wait and not buy a house because this still tends to be leveled off? That's why I tell buyers, if you can see you're in the same projection industry that we are, trying to project to buyers what's going to happen, because they always ask us as agents, what do you think the interest rate's going to do? I have no idea. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm not there to tell you, here's what they're saying this is going to happen. But they said back in October that we would possibly see 5 and 6% by spring. That hasn't happened. And now we're seeing experts saying we should be seeing maybe a 6% by August or September. But I'm looking at my buyers and say, that probably won't happen either. I don't know. I think it's got to be how important it is for you to own a property that's going to drive you, and not interest rates.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. From the financial advisor's perspective, I get the question a lot about, like, should I buy a house? I feel like I'm throwing away money on rent. And I think what people really miss is that buying a house or not is less a financial decision as it is a life decision. And there is a time and a place in your life where you're kind of ready to settle in, be somewhere for a period of time, own it for a long period of time, because as you know, home ownership, it's a hedge to inflation. Basically, what happens is you get your mortgage, and the second you get your mortgage, your principal and interest payment, it never goes up over the course of time. But everything else goes up, right? And so once you've owned the house for 5, 10, 15 years, you really start to see the impact of having a mortgage that didn't increase year over year while everything else has gone up. Yeah. Now, the argument against that is something we've been talking about, transaction cost. And, you buy a house and you're there for 2, 3 years. You don't, have the ability to see the offset to inflation, right? And 2, you've got to pay heavy transaction costs to get out of it. And by the way, it's actually more complicated complicated to buy a house while you already own a house because you've got to get approved for all of these things, right? And so it doesn't necessarily simplify. And though looking backwards, it has been a good financial decision because of how well the real estate market has done over a 2 to 3 year period. It's, you might have a real estate market that goes up, but you might have some costs that kick in with that house, and you might buy the house for X, you might spend Y and sell it for Z, and net of fees not necessarily come out ahead. By the way, the whole time spending money on property taxes, maintenance. What's so nice about rent is that when you pay rent, that's your monthly maximum, right? The reverse for a house, when you have a mortgage, that's your monthly minimum. And anybody that's owned a house will recognize that, like, there are months where it costs a lot more than the mortgage, and that's okay, because over time, if it's an asset that's the right place for you, your whatever it is that allows you to stay there and have a house, right? That really, I think, is the best part of it. And we also need to recognize, I think it's important that, when I talk to clients about their finances and they're going to buy a house, a lot of times they do ask about the interest rate. And one of the things that I think they need to realize is that the house and the mortgage are actually two separate things, right? You're buying a house, which is an asset, and then you're also buying a mortgage, which is a liability. And there are things that you can do financially. So as an advisor, when I have clients buying a house, and I did have clients that were looking at houses when interest rates were 7 and 8%, there's guidance that you can provide them around how to basically, like, for example, if you believe interest rates are going to go down and that you're going to refinance your loan, don't sink a ton of money into your mortgage to buy your interest rate down, right? Because when you go to refinance 6 and 8 months from now, if rates are lower, you might get a new loan, but you're not getting back that money that you used to buy down, your points, right? So I think that it's important to understand, one, where rates might go. You always have to be prepared to keep the mortgage that you get, because that's just smart. But I will acknowledge that with clients that I've had buying houses over the last 8 to 12 months, a lot of times the conversations that we've had is around how do you set yourself up so that you have options in a year, 2 years from now, if you want to get out of this mortgage, and you're not going to have cost yourself a bunch of money to do that. So anyway, I wanted to really understand your perspective. Again, we've asked a couple of times about, like, people that are out in the market buying. So for the listener that is either going to buy a house in the short term, or maybe they know they're going to have to buy a house longer term, talk a little bit about what the impact of some of this is over time and how they should be thinking about this.
Sure. Well, the settlement that is before the judge right now, NAR has tried to settle out of court with this, and 2 other major brokerages already settled out of court. But what the NAR in the settlement has agreed to pay $418 million over 4 years, and they have verbally, I guess, agreed, or just hadn't been in writing signed yet by the judge, but they have agreed that all broker agent commissions will not be on the MLS. So they will not be visible to, rarely are they ever visible to buyers unless the buyer's agent shows them what the commission is. But they're not even going to be visible to us as agents what the seller is offering a buyer brokerage commission. So it's going to be off. So let's say initially they were offering 3%, but now this agreement gets signed. They're projecting mid-July right now that this will go into effect. But now on the Cincinnati MLS or any MLS, you will not see the commission shared on there. So that's the one agreement. The other one is that all buyer's agents have to have a buyer brokerage agreement signed and in place, and we have to submit that. So it's for those agents that have not been using the buyer agent commission agreement, or not commission, buyer agent agreement. If you've not been using it, then they've got to be prepared to start using that. And that's where we talked about the value added. You're going to have to be able to prove that you're worth this. So essentially, you're going to be telling your buyer with this buyer agent agreement is that there are many boxes to check, but you're going to end up paying my commission, in essence, 3%, unless the seller is offering consideration for a buyer's agent. So the seller can still choose to pay a 3% buyer agent commission. It's just not going to be visible on the MLS. So it's going to be up to us agents to check, to be able to check on his buyer, but we got to have that agreement in place before we ever show houses now too.
Yeah. Like if I'm looking at Zillow and I look at the price of the house listed on Zillow, does that mean there's less transparency in the price that I see? Because if I'm a buyer, I might have to pay that price plus 3%, or I might have to pay that price plus 1%, or that price plus 0%, depending on what the seller's thinking.
Good question. I mean, that's one of the things that we're going to have to be able to share. We're going to have to tell them, most people will tell us that all the commission in the past, the 6% commission is built into the sale price.
Yeah, if I'm a buyer and I'm looking on Zillow and I see that a house was listed for $1 million, I expect to go to that house and pay $1 million if I offered asking. Right. Not $1 million plus is that, and is that what you're saying? Is that there's some likelihood that as a buyer you would now be paying $1 million plus a percentage?
Yeah, because now you're going to be paying possibly the buyer's agent 3% commission or whatever is signed and agreed upon in that buyer agency agreement. It doesn't have to be 3%.
Sure.
But for a buyer's agent who is, most new agents are buyer's agents, they're going to want to be paid. So the whole question is, by whom are we going to be paid by?
So so a lot of this is probably going to become part of the art of the listing process, right? Because it's going to be on the listing agent to figure out how they're going to clearly communicate to everybody. Because I can't imagine as a listing agent, you want potential buyers looking at the listing and not knowing what they're going to pay for it, right? So I would imagine this comes down to the art of how you write the listing, and we're probably likely to see something where it says something like seller pays all buyers commissions or something like, is that a fair?
Well, they're going to have something in the listing agreement that says what the buyer broker, they're agreeing to pay the buyer's brokerage to.
Yeah.
So that's already in our contract. But another thing is this is going to change. This is going to change our listing contracts. Buyer agency contracts will probably change. We already have one in place. Comey and Shepard's had one for years in place. It's just the buyer's agents weren't required to have it in place. But the transparency isn't going to be there because now the buyer's agent is going to look at that listing and it's not going to have a commission, agreed on commission. Because right now, if we see the buyer's brokerage commission, let's say at 3%, that listing agent and brokerage is required and that seller is required to pay that because they've signed the agreement. And it's visible to all agents on the MLS.
Yeah, the agreement signed by the seller. has language in it that makes sure both realtors are paid.
Correct.
And by the time you're selling your house, you've already signed away the right to negotiate that. Now, as the seller, you're going to sign an agreement that says, hey, I agree to pay my agent. And as the buyer, you're going to sign an agreement that says, hey, I agree to pay my agent. And if there's some back end shared revenue, that's kind of up to the brokers.
Yeah, and it will be transparent to us if we ask.
Yeah.
So the thing about a buyer brokerage, if you're a buyer's agent and you get that buyer agency agreement signed, but you say 0%, then essentially you're showing houses for free.
For free.
And what agent wants to do that? So there's talk there's all kinds of talk going out there, how this is going to change real estate. And there's talk that it's going to bring the housing prices down. I don't see that happening for years, because we're in such a competitive market with low inventory. It's still going to increase house prices. So I don't see that happening. My son called me from California. He listens to all these real estate podcasts now, and all of them are saying housing prices are going to go drastically down. So it's making housing more affordable. And I told him, well, maybe in 2 to 3 years, you might see some of that happening, but not with low inventory. So there are so many changes that we're going to see that we have no idea are coming right now. We really don't. And the nice thing is I think, well, I'm going to brag on our brokerage because our broker has been preparing us for this since November about the changes that are going to come.
But is this really, like, I know there was this court case got brought up in November, but like the concept that we're talking about like realtors being more transparent and more I'll say flexible, although I don't know if that's the right word here, having more wiggle room. Going back to one of your first comments, I didn't realize the 6% was negotiable. I think most people think that 6% is just the law of the land, and that's what you pay. I do think the most interesting thing here to me is that I think for decades there's been growing popularity to like create more competition in the space, right? Was this just the straw that broke the camel's back, or was this something that, are there real estate brokerages that have been talking about this for the last 10 and 20 years?
You mean as far as this coming? Or,
yeah, this case happens to be maybe the spotlight, the straw that broke the camel's back, but it's not. I think that this concept has been maybe in talks for a while, right?
Well, it's been in talks. I think every brokerage should already have been talking about this years and years and years ago. So I think it's going to change the industry in a lot. And I think there's a danger too. One of the dangers I see is that a buyer may go directly to a seller, to a listing agent, so they can bypass paying that commission. But the danger there is that buyer is not going to be represented by anybody.
Yeah, I'll hammer on that because I think I have had clients multiple. It's not uncommon for people to want to avoid paying a realtor in a real estate transaction because they think they're saving themselves a ton of money. And I'm not saying that it might potentially, there's arguable logic that it could save money. But what people really forget about is that you are entering into a legal transaction. There are contracts involved. You have to have representation. And whether that representation is your own attorney or your own realtor, the last thing you want to do is to have the buyer and the seller have the same representation because it's conflict of interest. Now you have one person that has two people's best interests in mind that are on opposing ends of a deal. Right. And that's I don't know that can really be done. As an advisor, I'll tell you that so I'm a certified financial planner. Part of the CFP is about reducing conflict of interest. And there's a lot in there to talk about when you have a client that gets divorced, you kind of have to pick one. Mm-hmm. You can't really serve as a fiduciary two parties' interests that are opposed to each other. And, I hammer on that because it's a mistake that I see time and time again is not thinking about having representation, legal for real estate or otherwise. By the way, this exists in any contract that people sign. It's really important to get somebody with the know-how that can look at that contract and discern, is this a good contract? Is there a bad contract? Should we write something else in? How do I make sure to preserve the interest of whoever I'm talking to? Because for you to think, where this becomes really muddy too, is when you're buying a house from a friend or, maybe a builder or whatever. And you kind of get caught that like this person is on my team. And it's important to recognize, I think, that whether or not you like somebody or whatever, when you're on separate sense of a contract and a business deal, you are doing business, right? And it's important to validate that you're making a good decision.
Yeah. So you're speaking of dual agency. So that in Ohio, dual agency is legal right now. There are some states that it is not legal. So that listing agent cannot represent both parties in some states. But what I'm talking about is I think you're going to see buyers bypass an agent altogether, go directly to the seller and say they're unrepresented. So you're not going to that seller's not going to owe anything, and that buyer doesn't have to pay anything. But it's dangerous because going in and represent, like you said, without an attorney either, I would not recommend anybody do that. And
I guess my point is whether you're using their realtor, you need your own representation, whether it's no representation or their representation. Human beings have a tendency to think we're smarter than we are. And we know things that we don't know what we don't know, so to speak. And when you get into something as quote simple as a housing transaction, and it sounds quote simple because so many people do it so much, but like these things are not necessarily simple. It is really important to have somebody that has the legal know-how and the financial know-how to say, hey, this is a good decision, this is a bad decision, and this is how you handle it. Because if you get into, I don't know if you've ever been in a lawsuit, or, for anybody that's ever had to deal with a lawsuit, it's not fun, right? And it's not fun for any parties involved. If you can avoid it, try to, so. Right. What other thoughts do you have? I mean, Todd, I want to give you the chance to share anything else that's on your mind for the listeners, but I think that you've done a pretty good job of answering my questions. So,
well, I think when this gets signed, this lawsuit gets settled and actually signed, I just tell buyers that a seller is paying their listing brokerage to represent them, and why wouldn't you hire a buyer agent to represent them in this transaction? So whether it's going to cost you more money, I think in the long run, it's going to help you out. But I caution these buyers that you really need to find the value added that buyer's agent is going to give you, and to be represented. And I challenge all new agents and agents in general to make sure you're telling your buyers what that value added is, because we do it with sellers. Why don't we do it with buyers?
Yeah. And I bet you right now, the interview process for your buying real estate agent comes down to, hey, do you have a friend that's a realtor, or something like that. Yeah. Right. So moving forward, interview your buying agent. If you are trying to buy a house, make sure that you're working with somebody that has good qualifications, understands how to structure these deals, understands your area, the local real estate values, and can help you get to a really solid deal. Yeah. If you're a seller, congratulations. You've probably done pretty well. And in this market, hopefully your seller's agent can work you through the proper ways to get your house sold.
Exactly. Yeah, they should. Mm-hmm.
Well, Todd, I really appreciate you coming in and sharing some of your expertise. I think a lot of listeners, whether it be for this court case or just otherwise, real estate's on a lot of people's minds right now.
Sure.
And it's definitely a hot topic area, and I don't think we're done thinking about it. So,
oh no, definitely not.
Well, we really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Opinions voiced in this material are for general information only and not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Advisory services offered through National Wealth Management Group, LLC, a registered investment advisor. Todd Finch and Comey & Shepard are not affiliated with or endorsed by National Wealth Management Group, LLC, or any of its affiliates.